Stop. Stop, stop, stop. What's going on? What's going on here? What? Every week it gives me a new problem to solve. Stop. Stop, stop, stop. What's going on? What's going on here? Hello, hello? Okay. All right. I guess we're okay now. When I have a computer weirdness, it's always a new one. You'd think that it would run out of tricks to play on me, but it never does. Okay, we're about to go live. I think we are live. Okay, now I can start introducing you. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. I'm going to have a lot of fun today. I get a chance to talk with an old friend. I hope it's okay if I call you a friend, Doug. Doug Roche.
I'm honored, Meta.
Doug Roche is one of my heroes, right up at the top of my list of heroes. He's a peace activist like you wouldn't believe. And not just a peace activist, but he's managed to find crevices in the system where he can become powerful for a few minutes and actually carry out governmental responsibilities. So he was a journalist or something originally before I even met you, Doug. And then I think when I met you, you were already the Canadian ambassador for disarmament, and you spent a lot of your time in New York at the UN. And I suppose you also went to Geneva sometimes, but I didn't follow your adventures there. And you held a lot of meetings of peace people where you get together with military people. We'd bring us together for a weekend in some sort of, not a resort, but some sort of location where people held, conferences. And I remember being part of maybe 100 people. Is that about how many people used to go to these conferences that you held?
About 50 to 75, perhaps.
Was that all? Okay, it felt like a lot more, but my memory is weak nowadays. Anyway, then he became a senator, and and I think that is probably the last official role that you've held. But all this time, you've had roles in very important, well, to me, important peace organizations, especially the Canadian Pugwash Group and and other sort of umbrella organizations that bring together activists. So this my summary of your life, which is obviously a very patchy uh, view of what you've done with your life, but I want to explore it. Let's after in our 90s, let's get to know each other, Doug, shall we? Let me ask you about your early life and how you got to be the man you are. Did you see it coming? Did you plan it from the time you were a kid? How did you come to be the kind of person that I think every Canadian uh, peace activist reveres, and lots of people who are not activists nevertheless pay attention to? You write columns or articles in the Hill, the newspaper that the people in Ottawa watch and read quite often, and you continue to publish books. I think it's like one book a year almost, isn't it? Anyway, let's start at the beginning. Where'd you come from, Doug?
Well, thank you, Meta, and thank you for having me. And I'd like to say that it was all planned, well thought out beforehand, but it's absolutely not. I I, uh, I wouldn't exactly say I stumbled, but I moved from area to area, and I do feel now, in retrospect, a certain guiding hand. I started out as a journalist, and I worked in the Catholic press. and I wanted a job in that field, and thus in the mid 1950s, I went to the United States where I thought I would get some experience, and I worked for a couple of publications there. And one of them, the Sign magazine, it was a very popular magazine, and it was a large circulation, and it sent me around
Sorry, what magazine?
the Sign magazine, SIGN, Sign magazine. It doesn't exist now, but it
Was that a Catholic
yeah,
magazine?
yes,
Uh-huh.
it was. Yes, it was a Catholic magazine, and it dealt a lot with the social teaching of the church, and
Mhm.
so they sent me various places around the world. And I went around Africa and Asia and Latin America, and I discovered I wrote the life story of an Igbo teacher in Nigeria, and I wrote the life story of a communist labor leader in Venezuela, and a life story of a farmer in Kerala in India, and concentrating on people like that.
Sorry, were
Uh,
these books or were they articles or what that you wrote about
these were articles that I wrote,
for this Sign magazine?
right, and concentrating on the lives of people who are in totally different sphere of life where I had come from, awakened me, and I realized one day that most of the people in the world are non-white, non-Western, and non-Christian, and that I'm in a real minority in the world. And in later years, when I started going to the United Nations, and like, which I've been going to the United Nations now for 35 years, um, on you go into the General Assembly, and on a full day, you look down, and there's 190 desks, 190 countries, 93 countries, with 6 people per desk, and therefore it's a lot of people on a full day. And when you look at it, what do you see? You see the faces of the modern world, and those faces are non-white, non-Western, and non-Christian, and thus that has reinforced in my own mind that we have to get along in this world. As John F. Kennedy said, "I'll breathe the same air." And we've got to get along if we're going to survive. And thus, and I then found myself when I came back to Canada and I came to Edmonton, and I found myself wanting to work on a larger stage. And I ran for Parliament 7 years after I arrived back in when I arrived in Edmonton. I was elected, and I served in the House of Commons for 12 years. And
Now,
in
okay, now, so you were elected to Canadian Parliament as an MP from Edmonton.
Edmonton, Strathcona, Edmonton,
Uh-huh.
Strathcona,
And that was about
uh,
when?
1972 when I was elected.
Oh.
And I started to specialize in development issues.
Uh-huh.
And I wrote a couple of books on development, what development is all about, and what constitutes development, and based on some of my experiences that I had had as a journalist traveling. And so when I continued on this path of writing development, the Club of Rome, this great think tank, asked me to write a piece about what development would be like in the year 2000. And by this time it was 1980. So they asked me to look 20 years ahead, what development would be like in the year 2000. And so I went back and started to do some original research. And the deeper I get into it, the more I realized that the arms race, and particularly the nuclear arms race, was it was so it had mounted such a powerful momentum that it was taking money from the development process, and it
Mhm.
was taking over the political decision-making processes, and so they were getting a militarization of foreign policy. And so I started to write about nuclear weapons, and I think and then I spoke in Parliament about it, and I was involved in lots of controversies in Parliament while this was going on. And so this, but this time was 1984, And I
Now,
decided, well,
excuse me, but now all this time when you were in Parliament, you were also writing.
yes, I
Were
was.
you still writing for the Sign
No,
magazine?
no. I'd left the sign. I'd left the sign. I was writing columns and for various papers, the Globe and Mail and various places, and Financial Post I used to write for.
Uh-huh.
Um, but in 1984, um, I decided that I wanted to spend the rest of my life working in peace issues, and so that was a deliberate, determinative step. Because I stepped down. I decided not to run in the 1984 elections. I was never defeated. I ran in four federal elections and was never defeated. So I stepped down in '84, and that was the year that Brian Mulroney won the prime minister, and Joe Clark was the foreign minister. And so they immediately appointed me ambassador for disarmament at the United Nations. And thus I was able to start to devote myself 24/7 to the work that I really wanted to do, to work on the peace agenda. So I did that for a while, and I was chairman of the United Nations Disarmament Committee. There's only been two Canadians who have chaired that committee in the whole history of the United Nations. The other was Lester Pearson in the 50s, and then myself in 1988.
Hmm.
And so I decided that as we got into 1990, I made another decision, namely that I'd had enough of government. I found the government too constraining for what I really wanted to say. And thus I left that post, and I just sort of went off on my own and started writing books
Now, hold
and
on.
work.
I want to interrupt you because you just mentioned something that I don't fully understand. I know that you don't, if you're a government official, you don't decide for yourself what you're going to say all the time. But I don't know the rules of that. And I'm not sure whether you can explain it clearly enough so that I'll know where exactly when you know with what you're not supposed to say and what when you know that you better check and when you know you're free to express your own thoughts. I did a talk with Bob Ray about, I don't know, a year ago or so, and of course he's the ambassador, Canadian's ambassador to the UN. And I wanted to have a conversation with him about the plight of various Russian men who fled from Russia rather than go kill Ukrainians. There are about 1 million of them, and they are having a lot of trouble because they can't get papers to immigrate to the countries where they want to go. And then they even have to leave if they settle one place, they have to leave every few months sometimes and go apply from outside in order to get back into the same place again and that kind of thing. It's they can't get work permits and things. So they have a lot of trouble. And I wanted to have him discuss it with a couple of these guys. I know several of them, and he couldn't do it. They said, yeah, he can talk to me, but he can't talk to Russians about that issue. He had to check with Ottawa and he was told no. Now, I thought that was awful, but then I think back to the time when you were the disarmament ambassador, and I could see that there were times that you were chafing and irritated because you didn't quite have the freedom to take the position that you wanted to take or because it was contrary to the government policy. Can you straighten me out on what is this normal? Is it true that all countries have these rules about what their ambassadors can say and do and other officials? And how do they know what the limits are, how far they can go?
Well, an ambassador, by definition, is a representative of his or her government. And when he speaks, the ambassador has to reflect government policy. The government, if an ambassador freelances and gets up in public and gives his own opinion, as a sitting ambassador, that confuses governments, it confuses the people. I mean, whose opinion is this? Is it the government or is it the ambassador's own? And thus, ambassadors, in order to maintain credibility, have to reflect the government position. I had a job where I was also dealing with the public, and I was trying to encourage and educate the public too, but I had to do it within the confines of of Canadian government policy. I will give you an example of what I mean. I was interviewed one day by media, and they said, "Should Canada be a nuclear weapons-free zone?" And I said, "Of course it should be. We don't want nuclear weapons in Canada." And that was reported. And the next day, the officials came to see me, and they of the government, and they said, "You cannot say that." And I said, "Why not?" They said, "Because we're a member of NATO, and NATO subscribes to nuclear weapons, and thus we cannot be a nuclear weapons-free zone." So to that, I said, "Well, we should change NATO policy." And some of them just rolled their eyes at me, and because they thought how difficult that would be. And that gets us into Lloyd Axworthy, who just digress for a moment at Lloyd Axworthy, who in 1999 did try, on behalf of the government of Canada, did try to change NATO policy, and they conducted a review, all right, but they never changed the policy. So an ambassador has to, in order to maintain credibility, he has to reflect, certainly in the
Well,
framework anyway
yeah, well,
of government policy.
but I could see how that would be an awfully well, a cognitive dissonance is the technical word for it. You have to be in a situation where lots of times you're saying things you don't believe, and you're not a liar. You're a very honorable man. It must have felt terrible to have to say
I
something you didn't
I
believe.
I never met. I have to make a quick correction here. I never said anything I didn't believe. Um, the policy of the Canadian government, and Joe Clark did set it down as foreign minister, was that we wanted to emphasize disarmament and nuclear disarmament, and we would keep working for nuclear disarmament. I mean, that was the framework of the government's policy, to which I, of course, subscribed. And it was only on some of the details. For example, the freeze movement at that time on a vote of the nuclear freeze. The resolutions at the UN were to freeze development of nuclear weapons and hold everything where we are now. So that made it very difficult for me. And but I never ever said in my speeches anything I didn't believe.
How would you handle it if I said, uh, "Mr. Ambassador, should Canada endorse a freeze of nuclear weapons?" And how would you answer me in
Uh,
those days?
I would say the Canadian government's position is that it's against a freeze. That was a true statement. That the government's position was, didn't mean it was my position.
Hmm. Okay. So
So,
it was it,
Meta, it's a trade-off. I mean, I could walk out of there any day and said, "Okay, I'm not going to work for you," and I had to weigh this all the time, and I with some of my own colleagues, I discussed these things, and most often came to the conclusion that the opportunities I had to influence government policy, I mean, I was a strong influence in having Canada reject the United States offer for us to join the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, otherwise known as Star Wars. So
mhm.
I was working behind the scenes. I worked for Canada to join the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And so, in order to be an influence on the government on the inside, on the projection of new policies, I had to maintain my credibility by not being seen as a renegade when out in the public. So you might say that's a trade-off, and it is a trade-off. Some ambassadors, I mean, on various subjects, I mean, don't hold any positions. They're neutral on positions.
Mhm.
I was very seldom ever neutral on a position. and I had to weigh the effect of my words to so that I could retain my ability to be an influence inside the government.
Okay, now you were there under Mulrooney and Joe Clark, and then I guess every time there's a change of government, there's a new ambassador appointed, right?
Well, I left before there was a change of government.
Remind me what all
When I,
happened.
when I
Remind me of that.
when I left in 1989, and Peggy Mason, who had been Joe Clark's assistant, she was then appointed ambassador for disarmament and took over that post. I went into private life, and what I did was I resumed my life as a civil society participant and an NGO, and I started the Middle Powers Initiative, which worked with governments and civil society leaders to use the strength of middle powers to make an impression on governments. And I drew from my experience when I'd been a member of parliament in heading the Six Nation Initiative. That was a group of nations that went to Moscow and to Washington to plead for an end to the arms race.
Mhm.
And we were like we were sort of forerunners of the treaties, the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, that resulted. I'm not saying we were responsible for that. What I am saying is that we worked in an atmosphere that produced treaties in the 1980s and 90s,
Mhm.
as I look back, and we'll maybe speak about this in a minute, but as I look back now, was a golden period of international relations with the end of the Cold War in 1989 and the 1990s, and the United Nations Security Council working in cooperation. Those were moments when we could move the world ahead.
Well, when I have any, when I even take a look at statements from people in Russia now, people who used to be involved in the same activities on your side, working toward disarmament or at least reduction of the threat, the most they will say is we need to resume arms control talks, a regime of arms control measures such as we had in those days. That's it's not a very bold, ambitious thing, is it? I was always a bit disappointed that they wouldn't even talk about disarmament. They would talk about arms control. Uh,
Well, when I was there at the period you're talking about, well, the period I'm referring to specifically is the late 1980s, the Gorbachev period, and the early 1990s, when I can assure you that the government of the Soviet Union, and then before it collapsed and became the government of the Federation of Russia, did talk about nuclear disarmament, and they even advanced resolutions for comprehensive nuclear disarmament, comprehensive I mean, integrating various policies. But they were rebuffed by the Western states, just as Rajiv Gandhi, then the Prime Minister of India, and went to the United Nations Third Special Session on Disarmament in 1988 and proposed a 15-year plan for nuclear disarmament, which with all sides would be equal in decelerating. And to that, the Western states gave him the back of their hand. And
mhm.
so, I mean, I can assure you, and I've written about this too, that it was the Western states that refused to walk through the door, so to speak, who turned back from the opportunity that was presented at the end of the Cold War to not only have a peace dividend, as it was called then, but to actually take serious work in decelerating nuclear weapons and on mutual, assured, and verifiable basis. And
Hmm.
that was being actively discussed, and the failure of that lies principally with the Western states. And I am here to testify to that. I have written about it, and uh, and then of course that gets you into the question of the enlargement of NATO, the NATO states, and the result of all that. But it is the the constant demand of the Western states that they be dominant, and particularly the United States. And even under such an illustrious president as Barack Obama, for whom I have a lot of time, but Obama, I remember distinctly Obama setting out the policy of the United States. And it's been here now we're talking about the early part of this century when he was elected in 2008. The policy of the United States is to be dominant in five spheres: air, land, sea, space, and cyber. And so you cannot have dominance and nuclear disarmament at the same time. So this is a great, great problem which has gotten worse, and I mean, by an order of magnitude, it's gotten worse as in the 20 years of this century.
I'm glad you said that, and I'm of course not surprised because when I said that the most that the Russians will say now is let's get back to arms control, they probably won't even say that now. This is stuff I was reading a year or so ago. Nowadays, I suppose even that is bolder than they many Russians will officially go because now they're really into a new arms race, I think. And but I'm perfectly aware that it was the Western side. Although you do hear people talking a lot of people asserting that it was Reagan who took the initiative and who was the great disarmer. Well, I'm glad to thank Reagan for everything he did. That was good, but it was certainly Gorbachev's. If you're giving awards out for the real peacemakers, I would have thought we would give it to Gorbachev first, right?
I don't want the listeners of this program to be confused about where I stand on this. Certainly, you mentioned Gorbachev, and that period I think needs to be honored in history. That he did offer a way out. As far as Russia is concerned today, I condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Mhm.
And I think it's a violation of the United Nations. It's a violation of the whole question of international law. And so I'm not here to defend Russia at all. All I'm saying is that if we're going to have peace in the world, we have to have dialogue. We have to have diplomacy. That's
Mhm.
why diplomacy was invented. It wasn't invented so people could have tea on Sunday afternoon. It was invented so that enemies would stop killing one another. And so the question of negotiations, and particularly a negotiated end to the present war in Ukraine, I mean, is the only way out of this present situation. But on Russia,
Mhm.
Russia is building up its nuclear arms. It's a dangerous. Putin has threatened to use, if you can imagine. I mean, he's threatened to use them several times nuclear weapons if the West strikes strategic targets within Russia. So I am under no illusions about the danger that Russia poses to the world, but I have to couple that in an honest evaluation of the world with the danger that the United States poses to the world. It is the United States that has rejected nuclear disarmament. They are now they are now on a plan of 30 years, Meta, in which they will spend $1.7 trillion modernizing and replacing their entire nuclear fleet. And so when they go to the United Nations and say, oh well, we're for nuclear disarmament, but it has to be done at the right time and so on. When they go on modernizing and leading the way in the development of new nuclear weapons, that is that makes a mockery of the pledges that they made particularly in the year 2000. It was probably a key moment when the states all pledged an unequivocal undertaking to the total elimination of nuclear weapons under the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which under Article 6 says they have to have comprehensive negotiations toward the elimination of nuclear weapons. And that Article 6 was confirmed by the International Court of Justice, and saying that states not only have a duty to pursue this, but they have a duty to conclude such negotiations.
Mhm.
And so the United States signed on to that, and have given lip service to it, but at the same time have maintained their drive for dominance in the entire nuclear sphere and other military spheres also. So this led them then to reject violently, viciously reject the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Why did we get a treaty on prohibition of nuclear weapons in 2017? We got that treaty which bans the possession of nuclear weapons, makes them illegal for those who sign the treaty. Why did we get that? We got it because the states were not fulfilling their obligations, their prior obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so we're living now we're sort of reverted into a nuclear jungle that we're living in now as a result of the failure of the major states, a failure of the major states to honor their obligations. And into that, I have to say that the Western states bear a major responsibility for the failure of nuclear diplomacy today.
And it looks as if the all the treaties are either expiring or their people have countries have withdrawn
Yes.
from the ones that were negotiated in what you call the golden years.
Well, the United States withdrew from the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty,
Mhm.
and withdrew from the Iran Treaty under Trump. They withdrew from the Iran Treaty, and they have never ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And so it's made it a very, very difficult period that we're living in now, when people are becoming sort of despairing or despondent that the international system doesn't seem to be working, and that is a whole subject by itself right now.
Well,
But
let's go there. Let's go there to exactly that issue. To me, the crucial thing that the one thing that is key to the whole mess is that international law cannot be enforced. I mean, it it's hard enough to say that we have a means of formulating and making international law, but even the institutions that exist that are supposed to make judgments about what is legal and what's not legal are ignored, and there's impunity for any country to go ahead and violate these, and there's nothing that can be done to enforce it. So I'm troubled most of all by the fact that there's no concerted effort to establish the authority of international law and means of enforcing it. And then, of course, we have the problem of the weakness of the United Nations and the difficulty of making it into any body that would be capable of addressing, frankly, not just, to my mind, not just the threat of nuclear war, because I've been working on that most of my life too now, but I think that there are two other threats that are equally or more dangerous and more ominous in my mind. And one is the threat of global warming, and the other now is the impending threat of it's not just a threat, it's also a promise, a glory of artificial intelligence, but with the extraordinary risks that seem to go with that. And there's no mechanism for controlling it adequately. So tell me your version of, or your vision of how to revive and restore and regenerate the United Nations,
Mhm.
make it into something that can actually do what we're going to need it to be able to do on many scores and within the next 5 years.
Mhm. No, thank you. There's a whole lot of things in your comment there. I'm trying to touch them in sequentially. Um, First of all, it's not really correct to say that nothing's being done to alleviate or strengthen the United Nations and the United Nations system. On the veto question, the United Nations would never have come into existence unless the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China all were given the veto to protect their own interests. It was a weakness of the United Nations from the very beginning. But that being said, the United Nations would never have existed if they hadn't done that. And when all is said and done over the now nearly 80 years of existence of the United Nations, the pluses of what the United Nations has done for humanity in the environmental field, in economic and social development, in arms control, and human rights particularly, the pluses for humanity that have been acquired as a result of the United Nations far outweigh the deficiencies and the failures of the United Nations. I mean, I'm the first to recognize the failures in Rwanda and Srebrenica and other places, and say the United Nations can't stop war. Well, one of the reasons the United Nations can't stop war is that the nations themselves that are particularly the five permanent members of the Security Council themselves won't stop war. So it's not the United Nations. The United Nations is what we make it. So I'm a firm believer that that there is not a person on the planet. I want to repeat that there is not a person on the planet who is not affected in positive ways, one way or another, by what the United Nations does, whether it's an economic and social or meteorological. I mean, the plethora of agencies that the United Nations has. Now, coming down to the practicalities of how the resolutions we can be enforced. Better, humanity is on a journey, and we are moving from the old culture of war, which dominated the 20th century. I mean, there were two world wars, more than 100 million people were killed. We had the culture of war driving the 20th century, spilling over into the 21st century. And gradually, as the Cold War ended, 1989, a vision of a culture of peace began to be formed in the minds of some important and key people. And that led to a document being adopted called the Culture of Peace. What is the culture of peace? The culture of peace is a set of values revolving around nonviolence, health, education, water systems, rights of women, education, a whole lots of things that constitute a culture of peace. And the United Nations passed that in the year 2000. They adopted formally the culture of peace, which set out a decade. The decade was to be from 2000 until 2010, in which culture of peace programs would be driven around the world. And they started that actually in the first year, in which there were many programs and of entertainment, youth, women's programs, education programs, to gradually get people to understand that the new possibilities for peace are coming as a result of the end of the Cold War. New possibilities. So, culture of peace. What happened? I will tell you what happened. The terrorists struck on 9/11. And when the terrorist attacks led to the war on Afghanistan and then the subsequent war in Iraq, and it led to a resurgence of militarism, and the military budgets and political pressures and the military industrial complex, all of that got a kind of a new life, so to speak, and began to drive policies. So much so that today military policies are driving foreign policies rather than the other way around. So that is what happened.
Mhm.
Now, finally, just in this little segment, I'll just finish this segment by telling you this: that the people who run the United Nations who go there, they're not stupid. I mean, they understand all these problems, and so they say, what can we do to mitigate what happens when the veto is used and we can't get anything done? So they passed a resolution which was adopted, in which now any state, any of the five states, the five permanent states that have the veto, any of the states that use the veto are required to come to the General Assembly and explain themselves as to why this. So this is already acting as a small break on the use of the veto. And this gets into the whole question of the reform of the United Nations.
Hold on. Can I
And, and,
ask when
and,
when,
and
when this resolution was adopted and whether there's been any application of it? Has any country actually
yeah,
gone to the General Assembly to
yeah,
explain themselves?
yes. Both Russia and the United States have have had to explain vetoes in the General Assembly.
Okay.
And this subject is now directly connected to the reform of the UN, which has been long sought, but which is now going through a new period of pushing for it, in which the United States has said that it will accept two African states as permanent members of the Security Council, and other states that are on the list to become permanent members of the Security Council are India, Brazil, Japan, and Germany, and of course they all should be. So, this is a slow and tedious process that is required to modernize, put it that way, to make the UN, which was established at a period in 1945, but that period no longer exists. In the interval, all manner of states have come into existence, and the world has changed, and the world has changed particularly in the past few years with the ascent of autocracy and confrontation. All of this is to say that I want to go back to what I've said before, that we're moving from a culture of war to a culture of peace. The culture of peace has been defined. We know what it is, and there are many groups in civil society. I mean, it's an enormous number of groups in civil society, in the environment field, the human rights field, the arms control, and human rights fields that are helping to move the systems of thinking forward. But we have not yet reached a stage in the development of humanity when we recognize the need for the enforcement of international law. We have defined international law. We have the International Court of Justice. We have the International Criminal Court. Each of them operate without the full ability of jurisdiction. I mean, this is to give you a homely example. You get in your car and you go down the street and you run through a red light, and a policeman comes and gives you a ticket. You don't have an option. You have to go to court. The local law is enforced. Internationally, you can threaten to use nuclear weapons and there's no enforcement. We haven't elevated humanity enough. Now, will it be ever elevated enough? My thinking is that it will be. We're going through a dark valley right now on this long journey from the internet, from a culture of war to a culture of peace. We're going to a very dark valley because it's not a straight line from a culture of war to a culture of peace. It goes all kinds of things that happen. So we have to live in, and we're fated to live in this period, but we dare not give up our aspiration and our hope and our plans for building a culture of peace just because it is so immensely difficult today.
I loved what you just said. I think that is absolutely true. And I think that I personally don't get discouraged, even though I'm pessimistic. Somehow, I don't want to try to reconcile those two things, but I'm not convinced that we're going to, as a species, survive much longer. And it's not just the inequities of um, the resources and poverty, et cetera. It's it's also these additional crises that are all converging in terms of, I think there's very strong chance that if only just take the seawater, the oceans are going to rise about 10 feet, most likely from everything that's happening now. There's still time to fix it, but I don't see the commitment there to even enable the people who could do it to start exploring it. And I think that, the growth of artificial intelligence, practically all our jobs are going to be missing. We've got to have a completely different economy. I don't have any idea how to do that, what kind of economy we need to create, but I'm sure that we're not doing it. We're not even looking at solving these problems. So I'm pretty pessimistic. But you talk a lot about hope, and and I can hear it in your voice that you have hope. I have a sense of duty. I don't think I operate out of a sense of hope. I think that if I have the sense that I'm supposed to be doing something, I have a mission, I have an obligation, I have an assignment, then I'll go ahead and do it, even though I think it's not going to work. and and so that's not quite hope. It's more like duty. But you talk about hope, and go ahead, sell me on hope. I'm open to being hopeful if you can persuade me that there are grounds for expecting
Uh,
progress.
uh, Again, you have penetrated this very dense and complicated subject in your comment, and I compliment you for the way you phrased that. But I would respectfully offer a little disagreement with you. You said we're not looking at these problems today. We're not. Well, but Meta, we are looking at them. There's an immense introspection going on among informed people.
Mm.
We used to have rallies or demonstrations only for our own rights. Now we're now having demonstrations for the rights of the Palestinian people in this present imbroglio. I mean, this is one example of which we're we're looking outward. You've questioned whether we'll survive because of the interaction of the major problems, the nuclear weapons, the climate change, and the pandemics, and all these things. I mean, will we actually survive? And you finally gotta have hope. Um, I I do not want to present myself as a Pollyanna figure and say, everything will be okay. I don't know. Maybe it all won't be okay. But I would say this: for the last 1,000 years, human beings have improved. We've made inventions, all kinds of things, whereby the goods of the earth are enjoyed or held by more people. More people are benefiting, put it that way. More people are benefiting from the values and the produce written in a wide word of the world than ever before. And so we tend to forget that sometimes, that we have in this long journey, the last 1,000 years, say, well, That's fine, but because the problems are so tough today that we're going to run out of room, we're going to run out of air, we're going to run out of things, and we're going to extinguish ourselves, whether by nuclear weapons or as they say, we're either going to burn up or blow up. I think, and I have to here I have to say that perhaps it's my faith, I perhaps, but I believe that we're here as part of God's creation. And we're in a moment in time of of a time measured cosmically. And it doesn't make sense to me that given the knowledge that humanity has, that we will actually extinguish ourselves or allow ourselves to be extinguished. When we came out of the Cold War, we had a whole lot of things going for us at that time in recognition of what needs to be done. The Secretary General wrote an agenda for peace, which he set out pretty clearly, and his modern successor has repeated it, the new agenda for peace, in which they set it out as the abolition of nuclear weapons, the recognition of nonviolence, the rights of people to food, to shelter, to health conditions. Um, I am not convinced at all that we're not going to make it just
But
because we've
look,
got this immense problems now.
how are we in any different situation from the last dinosaurs? I mean, let's say we were the last two dinosaurs or the last 1,000 dinosaurs in the world. And we had faith that, of course, God wouldn't let us be exterminated because God's doing something important. I agree with you. I believe the universe is doing something very important. It's got a plan, and we're part of it. And I don't quite know what my part is, but I can see your part more easily than I can see my own sometimes. Anyway, I believe yes, we got missions, we got assignments to do, and that sort of thing. I'm pretty much a believer. I'm not Catholic, but I'm. You and I are on the same page on that. But now in another 5 years, I may have a robot here that will be able to do things like fix my breakfast and take out my garbage and file my tax returns and give me legal advice and and give me spiritual advice. I mean, this robot will have read every spiritual leader that has ever been written and everything that's ever been decided about law and the nature of the universe and etc. So I think, suppose those guys, those little robots, those little AI people, decide that we are really so backward that they should just let us go. They shouldn't necessarily try to keep us alive because we're pretty stupid. And so we all go extinct, but then the robots are taking over. Well, would you say that could be possibly God's plan?
Well, first of all, I don't know that robots will take over. We need an artificial intelligence. We need a control system on it, and it has to be regulated, and so on. But I want to tell you a little story about artificial intelligence. I asked Chat GPT to write an essay for me
Mhm.
on the morality of nuclear weapons. Are nuclear weapons moral or immoral? And as you know, ChatGPT operates instantly, and in 10 seconds, I had the essay coming out of my computer. And they went through the whole thing about what some people say weapons are needed, they're necessary, and other people say no, they're evil, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it came down to finally the conclusion that ChatGPT, the best of AI today, concluded that with respect to the morality of nuclear weapons, that was going to be a human decision. And because the AI people, are not capable of determining the moral quality of an action. And
Ah,
that showed me that human beings there's we are still in control, and we need to maintain control to determine the morality of our actions. So we cannot offload morality.
well, this is a wonderful conversation. I really think we're really getting to a very crucial point because I think human beings right now would favor nuclear weapons, would, basically say that it's not immoral to have nuclear weapons. You and I are deviants. So why would I want human beings to control the decision making of these smart creatures? They're not creatures. What are they? The AI. Why would I want us to win when I think their judgment, if they actually go ahead and start making judgments based on everything they've been able to learn, I'm not sure I would trust human judgments over, or even want the
I have
control of human beings over these much smarter um, minds that are coming into existence. I like the expression species. I think we are creating a new species, and it's going to be 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times smarter than we are. And I think it's more likely to be wise than we are.
uh, undoubtedly wiser in the production of materials and so on, but I'm not sure it'll be wiser in terms of the analysis of the rightness or wrongness of things. That's called conscience. And the conscience is a very mysterious quality that we all possess one way or another, because it's inbred in our humanity. What distinguishes us from animals is our capacity to think and our free will to act. But before I forget it, I want to just come back to your thing about nuclear weapons for a moment. Um, the um, On the morality of nuclear weapons. Here we have now the Nobel Peace Prize Committee gave the 2024 Nobel Peace Prize to the Japanese organization Nihon, the Hibakusha, the people who are survivors of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they have taken the position all through the years that we cannot forget the terrible things that happened to people as a result of the atomic bombing, and that is what we must carry forward. I think that is an example of human conscience being applied and helping to direct future generations. And the thing that worries me, and why this was so good an award this year, because it has revived understanding. I've just written a piece for the Hill Times on this very point, so it's
Oh,
sort of
sure.
it's uppermost of my mind. What the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to the Hibakusha this year has done is to counteract the very thing you're talking about, namely the normalization of the acceptance of nuclear weapons. In other words, nuclear weapons have been with us for so long, and new generations of people coming along who don't have any understanding of what the terrible humanitarian consequences of the use are, that we need to be we need to be reminded um, of uh, of our responsibility to protect human life, and that we cannot ever accept the normalization of nuclear weapons. In other words, that they're a normal part of military and political doctrines, which is why I'm going to a conference next week. It's going to be discussing some of these subjects, and I'm going to make an intervention that we cannot lose sight of a nuclear weapons convention. It's true that we have a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons now, but that is not sufficient. We need to have a nuclear weapons convention that is negotiated by all the parties, including the major nuclear powers, a nuclear weapons convention negotiated that's verifiable in its dismantling of the entire nuclear weapon structure. That is absolutely necessary. And it is not AI that's telling us this. It's my human brain that is
Okay.
affected by the conscience that inhabits me. And that conscience is touched in this instance by the Habakasha.
Okay. Who would argue with that? Of course you're right. Of course. And of course you're doing exactly what you're called to do. And bless you. I'm so honored to have you in my life and be part of your life, or be engaged in supporting the same goals that you are have devoted yourself so completely to. So uh, I'm not as optimistic, but in a way, I'm more optimistic because I think even if human beings go the way of the dinosaurs, maybe what comes after us is not so bad. And maybe there's something going on that we should be happy for. And so am I hopeful or not? Would you call that hope?
Well, of course you. I think that you wouldn't have bothered talking to me if this morning if you didn't feel some hope that maybe together we can point the way to a little bit. See, Meta, there's no guarantee that it's all going to be peaches and cream at the end of the day. We don't have that guarantee, and I sincerely hope and nobody who is viewing this program will think that that's in my mind, let alone yours. We have no guarantee. We are instruments. I look at my own life as a small grain of sand on a very large beach, and but I have to do my part. Oh yes, and in doing your part, I mean, whatever it is, not all of us can go and be Secretary General of the United Nations, but we all live in a life, and we all touch people. We can all touch the political system at some level. We can all do something of that. There is no doubt, and it is in exercising that ourselves, in raising ourselves out of our own little milieu and reaching out. That is what energizes hope. That that produces hope. Hope is not something you go into a restaurant and order to be served on a platter. Hope comes from the activation of ourselves as human beings with a conscience.
Wonderful, wonderful. We've done it, my friend. This is the end of our conversation. We've used up our hour, and I can't think of a more enjoyable way to spend an hour than talking about these very difficult and I don't know what the word I want to say. These are difficult problems, but they are exactly the problems that I think we need, that we're being called to address, right? We must address these questions, and you're
Well,
the go-to man to tell
Meta,
us how we're going to solve one of them. And I bless you and thank you very, very much.
Meta, your publications and your videos and your whole life, I mean, illustrates on many, many, many avenues of this subject, your own capacity to generate hope in people.
Onward. Bless you, Doug, and thank you so much for this. I will see you again sometime soon. Okay. Love you.